专业名家汇集，市场大势解析，投资痛点事宜，时下热点直击。欢迎收看房东网名家讲坛。
Let's talk about the interesting question that some of the investors they are suffering actually. When they bought a new house, right, and they were not aware that they didn't know that how much the developer, the builder is going to charge them for the closing fee, for example, the levy fee. And then until the closing, they realized, oh, this is at least several thousand or some over 10,000 or over 20,000 for the closing fee there. And it's kind of a big surprise. And they were kind of super concerned that what can we do proactively to try to avoid those potential kind of a loss or whatever the expenses occurred that could damage their closing there.
Well, you're asking a great question again.
Thank you.
I think that today we're going through, and I'll use the example of condominium pre-construction.
Right.
As an example, a lot of investors are in that market where they'll purchase in advance a pre-construction project that won't get developed for maybe 5 years or longer. And so I think it's important. One, here are the steps. Get a good agent. Someone who is familiar with the market,
right,
who has dealt with these various builders. And usually if you get in at the beginning, you can get a lot of benefits. You may get free or reduced parking, free or reduced locker costs.
Right.
You'll also get the ability to get what I'll call caps, maximum amounts that a builder will charge. So typically in a builder's contract, there'll be an area where they want to be reimbursed for governmental levies and charges, for example. And there are a host of them. There can be developmental charges, educational charges, park levies.
Right.
There can be what are called Section 37 Planning Act charges that deal with municipal improvements, like a builder to get more floors will contribute money for a community center, for example. There might be today contributions dealing with transportation, transit, like TTC, GO Train, Metrolinx. So there's a host of governmental costs that builders have to pay for. And usually there's no limit. In the agreement it says you got to pay your proportional share. You want to get those capped. It can be based on, it could be depending on where the project is. Is it in Toronto, outside of Toronto? And very often builders will give you what are called caps on these charges and levies. Sometimes it'll be based on how large your unit is. If it's under 2 bedrooms, if it's under 3 bedrooms. So they may say, for anything under 2 bedrooms, there may be a $12,000 cap plus HST. For under 3 or the 2-bedroom range, it may be $15,000. Sometimes it can be 3 ranges. That's the kind of thing you want to get.
So that's the key, one of the keywords of
That's
capped,
one area capped. Sometimes you'll get benefits, like they'll give you a credit back. They may give you, 1-year TTC pass. But let's focus in on the caps. So your agent in step 1 has to try and get those amendments. Step 2, when you're getting the amendment, sometimes the builder would say it's personal to that buyer. So that if later as an investor you want to assign your unit to another buyer, you may not be able to take advantage of those caps as a selling point because it's personal to the original buyer and the builder. So you got to be careful.
Right.
So step 2 now is getting your lawyer. You under these residential condo pre-construction,
Right.
you have a 10-day cooling off period. You go to your lawyer early. They review it for you. They tell you what the costs are. They
Right.
tell you the things that you should be capping or what you should be concerned with.
Right.
We as lawyers then send a letter to the builder lawyer setting that we want this cap, that cap.
Right.
So, and what will happen is often you'll have maybe 4 to 5 provisions in your contract that deal with these closing costs. So in addition, there's utility costs.
Right.
There's a number of costs depending if it's condo or a single family home. But you'll get 3 out of 5 maybe capped. But there'll always be 1 or 2 that are not capped.
Right.
And sometimes it's not the builder's fault. They don't know at that point. They don't know what that cost is.
Yeah.
But at least I can get out a letter saying we want, I review it. Here, buyer, got to be aware of these points. Second, I'm sending a letter. Here's a copy of the letter. You got to decide that if we can't get caps, what is your downside? So we did, for example, I remember one case several years ago, a project at Shepherd and Yonge area, where everything was capped except for the Section 37 and the park levies. Well, collectively between the two came out to $25,000. Well, here you have a builder who tells the lawyer, 10 days before closing, we get a statement of adjustments. All of a sudden, we are surprised.
Right.
We don't want surprises. Our clients don't want surprises.
Right.
We've dealt very recently with a builder on a condo project north of Highway 7 where they increased, they took for themselves a credit of a lot of money on the basis that their materials cost more. And there have been contracts with builders where they allowed themselves the ability to increase the purchase price by certain percentages based on percentage increase in the materials that they were using. Because it can take 3, 4, 5 years to complete a project.
Right.
Okay? This was one project where there wasn't that provision in the contract, but later the builder, through use of I'm trying to be careful with words, provided certain paperwork to be signed at the interim closing, later that said allowed the builder to charge more. The builder said that was an amendment to the agreement of purchase and sale. We said that it was not. And through carry-on laws, the contract, and a common law, we were able to advocate for our buyers a settlement where they didn't have to pay. But certainly that there was this period of time where we as lawyers were very surprised. Our clients were surprised and very unhappy. So the importance of having a good lawyer who looks after your best interests. But that's step 2. Alluded to, when you get to step 3 where there is a problem, you need a good lawyer to advocate for you.
Right.
And if you have not a problem so much with the contract, but if you have a problem with a financial issue, some people got to sell something to buy. Sometimes they can't bring in their money from outside of the country. So we have to go back to the builder and we have to work with our clients to educate them to say, listen, don't ask for a year extension. The builder's not going to provide it. Okay, you got to be realistic. So, only within the last 48 hours, we had a client who was in a very difficult position based on the contract terms.
Right.
They were closing. We were fortunate that we were able to get a 3-month extension for just additional deposit, no other cost. So, anyways, obviously, if there are people that have questions about that, they can always call me.
So you mentioned that the second keyword is that there's a 10 days cooling period.
Yes.
And also step 3, that got to work with the professional lawyers to resolve it if there are any challenges or issues there.
Absolutely.
Great. So we move to the another question, talk about the HST rebate. And from time to time, some investors are asking that for buying a new home, right? A new house, that under what condition, what qualification that they can be qualified to get those HST rebate, because they kind of hesitating put in for primary residence or put in the real estate investment houses there. Those are their questions.
Again, a question that can have many answers.
Right.
I think that we'll call the investor or the buyer.
Right.
What is their purpose? What is their end goal? And sometimes they may not know themselves.
Yeah.
We're talking about an investment that may see several years before there's a closing.
Okay.
And what your needs or wants on day one may not be the same 2
Even that
years
could
later.
be changing during those few
Always
years.
changing. As an example, I had a client that bought a 1-bedroom unit, or 1.5, in Aura downtown. And Aura took, I think, between beginning to end about 7 years. And when it came time, when he signed the contract, he was, we'll say, a student, and eventually had a job.
Right.
And he was single. And having a 1.5-bedroom condo suited his needs. But it took so long for the project to reach closing that by the time the closing notice came, he was married and had 2 children.
Things, the situation completely changed.
Exactly. Right. So here, when he started, it was for him personally.
Right.
Now, it just so happens in that specific case,
Right.
the price was so good that he kept it as an investment. Okay. But I think you have to look at what is potentially your goal. We see cases where when people are when we're reviewing in the 10-day cooling off period, we'll get them a right to lease. Because on day one, they're saying, well, right now it looks like I want it either for myself or maybe my university son or daughter.
Right.
But longer term, maybe I will want it to rent out. I tell them that if you get this amendment for leasing, you're in some respect, at some level, telling the builder that you may want to lease. And therefore you may not, you're putting yourself into this gray area where the builder thinks that maybe you don't want it for your personal use, taking you out of being qualified for the HST housing rebate. So anytime I send a letter to the builder for that 10-day cooling off, I specifically state that in the 10 days, that notwithstanding that they have a right to lease, they haven't made a final decision. and that they may still want it for their own personal use, and therefore having the amendment to lease, the right to lease, shouldn't stop them from potentially still retain the right to have the HST housing rebate credit for final closing. So that's one protection. The contract would say, and the law, that it's for individual person. So it's for your personal use or that of an immediate family member. So I'm buying the condominium. It may be for me, could be for a son or daughter,
Right.
could be for my mother, father, but it's not for aunts and uncles and cousins.
Right.
So you got to be careful. If an investor acquires a unit, hasn't made a decision yet whether they're going to have it or invest and rent it out. However, they decide to assign it. They have to know that the party who's buying from them, even though that party may want it for their own personal use, that party will not be given the HST housing rebate on final closing.
That's another good point. Yeah.
Okay, they won't get that credit. And that ultimate buyer would have to wait till closing,
Right.
after closing, to apply
Right.
and qualify. I think you have to be careful. I think that if you're moving in, I think, there's a sort of a general thought that you have to retain it for a year.
Right.
I've seen cases where CRA, HST people have come back
Yeah.
and have reclaimed back the 24,000 because it's less than 1 year, or
Right.
they felt, when you have a buyer who 2 months after sells it, the government feels that
2
when
months
you
after
bought
closing,
it,
right.
you didn't have any intention.
Right. Right.
So if you're in a gray area, I will tell clients, if you think you're going to use it for your personal use, you have to be able to show the government a direct physical contact with that unit.
Right.
So at interim closing, for example, not final closing, reserve the elevator. Because remember, at interim closing, you're supposed to take possession.
Right. Right.
Reserve the elevator. Ideally move in furniture.
Right.
Get a moving bill.
Right.
What would you do
Those
if you
evidence,
were living?
Yeah. To prove.
Change your address.
Right.
Change your license,
Right.
which would change your OHIP card. Change your, have from the post office, have a receipt that you changed the address to this new unit. Changing your address at the bank. That you're getting mail or you're getting online payments, but notifications from banks, insurance companies
Right.
of the new address.
Right. All those evidence can support
Indicia
exactly
of showing that I live there.
can show to the government that your intention.
Right.
That, yeah.
I love newspapers rather
Right.
than reading news online. I get
Right.
newspapers delivered to my house.
Right. Right. And you mentioned that gray color area. That's really happening with quite a certain percentage of the investors because they were not 100% sure whether which side they were supposed
Listen,
to
I'm
stand.
dealing with cases that where between interim and final closing or right after final closing, I'm dealing with a couple where one of the parties has passed away. I'm dealing with couples or an individual who maybe gets a job in Vancouver and is moving for a job. Maybe I'm, a matrimonial problem.
Right.
People are separating, divorcing.
Right.
I'm dealing with people who for one reason or another. Like I've had several cases where they may have had a son or daughter who then becomes ill and they move back home. But it was there when they did live there. The intention was that it was for their personal use. And the government comes back even after closing and says, you didn't qualify. And that even if you got the credit on final closing, we're taking it back. And often they'll charge a penalty and charge interest.
That's probably we can go back, say, use the word in good faith, right? Yeah.
Well, you try in good faith. You go into intentions. I've dealt with a number of unfortunate examples where there may have been medical reasons why the individual who was living there went to another location, but the government didn't seem to be very open to what the issues were, and they were going by the book, so to speak. But there is a discretion in these various taxation laws that that the government individual official working on the file, there is this discretion. So when problems arise, people have to go to the lawyer. We, for example, if we see an issue with HST or the foreign tax or whatever, or, income tax, capital gains, we'll get them in touch with a taxation lawyer. Where we see a lot of problems is that people tend to put off the problem. They don't face it. They avoid it. And there are time limits, especially with government and taxation, that we have to do it within certain periods of time.
Time is essence. It comes back again. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We talked about the regarding the leasing the house, right? And the how to manage with those rental disputes. And that's probably happening every day and with different investors. That how typically, from the legal perspective, what's the better strategy that in dealing with those rental disputes? That, for example, that they don't pay the rental, the tenant is now willing to move out, whatever those that it damage your house, it really delay your house sales, whatever those,
From my most recent experiences, certainly in the last 12 months, I see three areas. First area is where an investor is trying to sell, and the buyer wants it for their use. You give the tenant the statutory government form under landlord-tenant laws, an N12, for example, and the tenant refuses to move out, and you can't sell it. Yet, someone would say, well, get rid of your tenant before you put it on the market. But maybe you don't have a legal right to give notice to the tenant to move out. They're paying their rent. They haven't defaulted. So if you're selling it, you got to sell it. Now you can have discussions with that tenant. You can tell them, look, I got to sell it for whatever reason, or I want to sell it. Tenant, there's a fair chance I'm going to sell it to a buyer who will want it for their own personal use, and I'm going to serve you with an N12. And you can have emails confirming this. And very often the landlord says, hey, I told the tenant, I gave notice. That's not sufficient. When at the right time, when you have a buyer who's going to use it for their personal use, you got to use the government statutory form, and you got to serve them. Well, right in the form, it says that the tenant doesn't have to accept moving out, that they can appeal this or go to the landlord-tenant tribunal. Well, what do you as a seller, whether you want to sell it to move somewhere or you're an investor, you can't sell it on the closing date, and you end up being in breach of contract.
Right.
And you have a buyer that doesn't want to assume. So that's one area, very difficult. Very difficult. That we run into many problems with tenants that refuse to move. Now remember, tenants may feel that to move out now with the rate, like what the rents are today, that they can't afford to move to a similar unit because they can't afford the rent.
Exactly. That added another challenge on those scenarios
Exactly.
as well, right?
Second area will be where the landlord themselves, they may have personal issues, financial issues, where they have to move into what was the rented unit, the dwelling,
Yeah.
and they end up telling an N12 covers not only a buyer, but you as landlord, if
move
you
back,
need
right.
it personally,
Right.
you run into similar problems.
Right.
You can have a doctor's note saying that you got to move in, that your life is stressful, you lost your job, you can't afford to, you got to sell this house and you got to move into this house because
Right.
you're an investor, move
Right.
into your own investment unit. And again, you have problems for many of the same and different reasons with the tenant that refuses.
Right.
So now what do I do where I need it for my own personal use and I can't get it? Then the third is more in line with what you were asking. I'm a landlord. I'm having trouble with the tenant. They're not
Right.
paying rent. I may have more, I may have two tenants. One is disturbing the other tenant. There's a whole host of reasons where I'm having problems. But most common, let's say, they brought in another person who was not in the lease, where it was one person and now it's two people, and they're causing issues. Maybe
Right.
there's fighting going on.
Right.
But most common, the rent is not being paid. What do? Well, you got to give notice. They don't move out. Then then you have to apply to the landlord-tenant tribunal. Can take a long time. There are some precautions. Make sure that you have the right tenant to begin with. You know, get employment letter. Call the employer. I can't tell you, there are times where a landlord gets an employment letter and it's a fake letter. And
That's not that uncommon, eh?
okay, and you phone the employer and it's a fake phone number. Or the person, maybe it's the right number, but that person doesn't work for them.
Exactly. Could be a
Okay.
fake person.
Try and get a credit report. Certainly if you're taking first and last month's rent, don't take a personal check. Take a bank draft. Okay? But at the end of the day, you'll never be 100% sure that you get a good tenant.
Right.
Now, the other thing is you can start off having a good tenant that gives you first and last month's rent. They have a job, they can afford it, but life interferes and they lose a job.
Right.
They can't afford to pay the rent.
Right.
So you can start off with a good tenant and end up having a bad tenant. But there are certain things, precautions that you could take.
By the way, that for those some of those rental laws or regulations could be province by province, right? For example, in the Alberta, in some other provinces, then they may have the right to say, if I want to sell the house, and I have the right as a landlord to ask the tenant to
That's
sell it.
very true. I'll just speak to Ontario.
Right.
If you're an investor and you have a property, you have properties in various areas of Canada, then you got to get a lawyer that specializes, or a paralegal that specializes in it. Now, I find a lot of my landlord-tenant issues tend to be, ends up having to do strategic settlements. Even though you may want to give a tenant an N12, you may have to deal with an N11 where landlord and tenant work together.
Right.
and they agree upon a day in which
Right.
the tenant will leave.
Right.
The landlord will have to, even on an N12, I believe that the form says you got to give 1 month's rent anyways.
Right.
However, on an N11 today, practically speaking, and we use a paralegal for this type of work, especially where we act for a landlord, you end up negotiating what will it take to get the tenant out. And sometimes it's not law we're talking about, we're talking business.
Right.
Landlord, tenant says, look, you want me to leave? I'll leave, but I can't afford to in the beginning. So for example, if I'm paying $2,000 a month and now I'm going $2,500,
Right.
it's difficult. So you say, listen, I'll give you the first and last months. So you have the cash flow. I'll give you 1 month free here. I'll give you 2 months, first and last, $2,500, and I'll pay reasonable moving expenses. But what I've seen is sometimes a landlord says, here's $10,000, and they give it to the tenant before they're supposed to move out, and the tenant still doesn't move out.
That comes the very, very embarrassed, very bad.
Heartbreaking.
Right.
So in my cases, what we work out is to say, here's the bank draft. I'm the lawyer. I will give you my letter that when you move out, here's a bank draft made payable to you, tenant. And I give a personal lawyer's undertaking that when you vacate, I will give you this bank draft. But you got to vacate.
So there's a prerequisite in getting it.
We put in precautions.
Right. Those are some very good comments and suggestions, especially for some investors talk about the houses that were built prior to November 2018, and they had those, currently they have their financial challenge, but they want to increase their
Listen,
rent.
if you're an investor and you have several units, you may be able to move. If you want to sell one, maybe you can move your tenant over to an alternative unit, and pay their moving. Usually there are solutions. However, listen, there are good and bad landlords, and there's good and bad tenants.
Right. That's a very, very honest opinion there. Recently, since the COVID-19, and a lot of those legal document signage, the signing signature, have become more remote, becomes not physically come to the office. So regarding those signing electronic copies, from your experience there, what are the things that need to be alert or to be aware of?
So there are two aspects of it. So what we would talk as electronic looks like a photocopy that someone has signed. The original ink we call wet signing. We as a law firm, it's interesting because for a long time we didn't go with the electronic. And part of the issue is that especially on the mortgages, they weren't being accepted by lenders and lender lawyers. So we had that issue where we had to only use original. During that time, we would do remote. We were one of the first law firms working within the Chinese community doing remote signing with overseas Chinese community, whether it be mainland Hong Kong, Singapore, other areas of the world, where what we did is we would go on platforms, could be WhatsApp, various platforms, Zoom, or very commonly WeChat. And we film the signing. So we get the IDs first, we have. Then we arrange the time, we go on WeChat. Oh, and we pre-send through WeChat, we send the paperwork that's going to be signed.
Yep.
We set up the time. We then meet on the platform. They sign, I see them. We compare the IDs.
See them on
that
real time.
We see them real time.
Right.
And they will send back the signed copies, and they'll courier the originals.
Got it. Got it. So there's kind of a double safe way that
Right.
protect, right?
Okay.
Right.
We do the same with powers of attorney. Everything, and we keep a library of all the films, so we can go back. We keep records.
So
of
the
it.
goal is to get the original copy always. There.
We always have original film copy.
Right. Right.
When we do it, we ask that we see the room that they're in. So we don't see, we want to make sure that they're signing freely.
Right.
Now, as we passed COVID, we kept doing remote, even with people living locally,
Right.
to give them an option.
They're kind of more used to the this easier way. Yeah.
But now we have made a firm decision to go to electronic, and we'll use electronic, but then again, you have the certification safeguards that go with
Right.
it.
Right.
So we do both. We're in very much of a service business. We have to, certainly, I'll speak for myself, that we're available literally 24/7. I work Saturdays, Sundays.
Ooh.
I keep my phone under my pillow.
Super diligently.
Well,
carry there.
you never know when you have emergencies.
Right.
I'm dealing with people that are 12-hour differences or more. We have clients in Australia, clients in Korea, China, Iran. So you have to account for it.
Right.
I mean, we try to give the best quality work,
Right.
the best advice, the best service at a fair price.
Right. Right.
And a lot sometimes, what distinguishes one service provider to another is the service.
Right.
And we have to be able to provide service, certainly to the Asian community.
Right.
We want to be there for them. Now we do have, we have the ability, we have physical locale that we have people in Beijing, Nanjing, Shanghai, Hong Kong. So, for example, if I need something signed, I have, it's interesting how life interferes.
Right.
So, for example, I have a number of lawyers who I'm friends with, who are Ontario licensed lawyers, but had to return to China because they may be an only child and they're looking after parents.
Right.
So we kept in communication and we retained them to help us with transactions in those major cities. And so we work hand in hand, that we're able to provide a service that certainly many other law firms could not provide.
Exactly. That they provides more geographically, that the positions or locations that they allows them to help you. Thank you. We talk about some auction houses or homes that you also mentioned some power of sales that we have kind of two different opinions talking about those auction property. That some investors say it might be a good deal just to catch some miser. Some may think, oh no, hold on, it could be potentially a trouble. So what's your comment on those type of businesses?
Well, my quick answer is yes and yes. Every coin has two sides.
Right.
I think both can be useful tools, like whether the regular market or let's say the auction.
Right.
there's different kinds of auctions. There's a true auction where you have a reserve bid that it can't go below. And I've seen auctions where they'll go to, you know, a larger home, a more expensive high-end home,
Right.
to attract a wider market, and they'll set up a tent in the backyard and serve food, and they have a real auction. Those can work well. Sometimes it's a technique where someone will say, we're going to sell it for $1. And all it is a game to attract a large number of people and see whether they're able to go over what they're, in their mind, what would have been their list price.
That $1 just try to attract the attention.
I don't usually
Yeah.
find that the $1 type of auctions, my experience certainly recently, does not work. I think that people are smarter. I think that a lot of the agents are onto that
Right.
game.
Right.
And I don't think it works. I think that there are types of properties that a true auction can work, where it's a win-win.
Right.
It's interesting, today we see certainly the market over 2 million, 3.5 to 4 is a very difficult market price point.
Right.
Once you're getting 5, 6, 10 million, it's not as hard because different types of people, buyers in each market. I think you're going to see something coming on the horizon that you may not be aware of, and that is there's going to be a change in land transfer tax come January 1, 2024. And that will be the Toronto municipal land transfer tax, where land transfer tax at certain price points is going to go from 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%. I have people wanting to buy higher priced homes today to avoid that. That in fact they're going to buy today, lease back the home to the seller, and then close on it, move in after January 1st to
2024.
avoid the land transfer tax. Now this is a municipal land transfer tax increase, but we're already seeing people planning for it.
Those are kind of very interesting scenario there. Eh? Yeah, with those, so that's why we got the different opinions on or comments based on their specific experience or their whatever they're knowing, that they feel they have a different concept or different feedback on those auction house. You mentioned the other day, talked about the need to work with the reliable law firm that, as part of it, mentioned that have a professional team. One of those is a reliable a law firm there. What are the qualifications or characteristics that you feel that could be coming into this bucket that you feel could be qualified to be a reliable law firm there?
Yeah. First of all, I think your first point, I think whoever you gather as part of your team, they all got to be qualified.
Right, right.
With lawyers specifically, I think there are some key questions. Whatever professional you hire, you want them to be good. That goes without saying.
Absolutely, yeah.
Here are some questions. One, and they're easy. How many years experience does the lawyer have? Overall.
Right.
Okay? Experience makes the difference.
Right.
In real estate especially. Because if you have a problem either as buyer or seller, you want a lawyer who has worked actively in a buyer's market and in a seller's market.
Right.
A lot of these ways of handling the problems you don't learn in law school. It's all experience.
Exactly.
And what worked in one market is not going to work in another market. What worked in 2008 may not work in 2023.
Right. Right.
Laws changed, markets are different, interest rates. So you need a lawyer who's worked both markets and not just once. You've worked for several buyer and seller markets, that you've had the opportunity to deal with problems. An author, Malcolm Gladwell, talks about in one of his books that you have to have 10,000 hours experience to consider yourself to be an expert in a field.
Right. Right.
So I find that once a lawyer has hit 5 years out, they've gained certainly a lot of experience. So how many years has a lawyer been in practice? 2, how many years of that practice has the lawyer done real estate?
Right. More relevant experience there. Right.
3, what is the percentage of the lawyer's real estate work in the relation to all their work?
Right.
Do they do 25% real estate and 75% family law?
That shows the focus. Yeah.
Right. Next, so that's the main focus.
Right.
What are their resources? How many lawyers do they have? Now, you don't need to have 20 lawyers. It can be 2, 3 lawyers.
But very experienced.
Do they have experienced staff?
Right.
Do they have the right people? What is their customer service? What is their process? When the file comes in, I say to you, okay, so you're going to handle my purchase. Tell me, how do you handle it? Interview the lawyer. Say, I'm giving you my file. I'm giving you my case.
Right.
Tell me from step 1 to closing date, what are you going to do?
That's a very, very good comment. And many of our investors, they don't necessarily know that there could be one step here that could potentially have a chance to interview the lawyers there.
You can rate me, I got to be honest, a buyer or seller, you are the boss. Don't be pushed to use anyone. Now, you may be using an agent that may be referring you to a lawyer.
Right.
I have agents that refer, they give out 2, 3 lawyers' names, and I get clients calling me. To me, what I tell a client is, I want to give you the best service, I want to give you the highest quality work, but I'm not going to charge you the cheapest or the highest, but fair.
Right.
If you're looking for the lowest pricing, I may not be the right lawyer for you, because I'm not going to cut corners. I will get title insurance. I will send out if the property is being sold as a new house,
Right.
but really is someone built it, and it's no carry-on coverage. I'm going to get a building zoning report. I'm going to get a property tax certificate.
Right.
I'm depending, maybe I want to check conservation authority. Where's the property located? What are your concerns about it? So I want the client to interview me. I welcome it.
So you can demonstrate that convince the potential clients.
Yeah, what I'm looking for.
Right.
And I would tell them, for example, like my case, I have 43 years experience. Our law firm's practice has been exclusive for real estate and business law. In the real estate area is a high percentage component of our overall practice.
That demonstrate extensive
In my
experience
43 years, I've been in real estate, whether I was a real estate lawyer for a bank, I was a real estate lawyer for a large national brokerage, I was a real estate lawyer for several large mega law firms, but it was real estate. So a lot of my experience is in the real estate area. I've worked through 1980 problems, 1982 problems, 1986 problems, 1992 problems. Through all these downturns, upturns, low interest rates, high interest rates. I started real estate practice when the first mortgage was 21%.
That was crazy at that time, right?
Okay, but you have that experience.
Right.
All our lawyers that we have are very focused on real estate and strategies to deal with it. And to deal with financing issues and contract issues,
right.
buyer seller. Also, our network, we know a lot of the builder lawyers. We know a lot of the lawyers out there. So if we have a problem, we can call them on
those connections can
a
also
more
make
collegial level
right.
to say,
right.
listen, builder lawyer, here are the problems we have. But because of the relationship built over 5, 10, 20 years, the lawyer trusts me and says, we have credibility.
Right.
Our staff, we have a staff of 12 clerks. Some just do commercial real estate.
Right.
Some just do purchases and sales of businesses.
Right.
We have 6 clerks that only do residential real estate. So they know the problems, they know the issues, they know when problems occur.
That's very good.
When the file comes in, we have a clerk that will call the client as intake information. So you're going to get several people working on the file, not just me. They'll call, are you married? What's your spousal status? What's your birthday? The information we need to complete all the forms, agreements, and work with you. Then it'll go to the clerk. The clerk, if it's a buyer, will do the title search. We'll do
right.
all the different parts to it. We'll set up, it'll go all the way dealing with the other lawyer, dealing with problems that arise.
Right.
We do work, we don't charge by the hour. We provide a package arrangement that's all inclusive with title insurance. We have a very special relationship with our title insurance provider where if we have problems, we can obtain title insurance where other law firms cannot.
Right, right.
Especially where there's private mortgages. That if we tell our title insurance that we're the lawyers acting on it, they trust us.
That's currently
so that there's no mortgage fraud.
Right, right.
The issues of fraud, owner fraud and mortgage fraud are big issues today as well.
Right.
When you're an investor, those risks can become higher.
Right.
If you're not living in the house and you have a tenant, here's a problem. If you don't mind, I can divert. This is a problem. We've seen now 3 cases in the past year. Investor. Tenant comes. They say, hey, listen, I'm not from around here. I understand that you may feel uncomfortable leasing. Right. I'll tell you what, I'll give you not just first and last rent. I'll give you the first 6 months and the last month I'll give you a bank draft certified check.
7 months in total.
So the investor says, that's great. But what they don't know is now that the tenant goes in, they're working with a fraudster who then comes to magically buy it,
right,
using the investor's name, so they can get people in to show because they got now a fake tenant on the inside.
Right, right.
And a lot of mortgage fraud and a lot of ownership change fraud occurs because of that. That's a higher risk for an investor than someone who's buying for their own personal use.
Those are very, very good comments there. So we have a last minute here that as a more than 40 years experience, a very successful lawyer, if you could give us some sincere opinion or even some recommendation to our investors, what would you say?
I think and it's not necessarily legal. I think my advice to them is don't be greedy. Be consistent in your investments. Know your go-in price. know your going out price.
Right.
Be disciplined. Don't jump at something because you think it's so good, because probably it isn't. Be prepared to walk away.
Yep.
Be prepared to leave a little bit of money on the table for someone else. You don't have to squeeze to get the last dollar.
Right. Right.
Get a good lawyer. Get a good agent who
Yep.
will look after your best interests. That's my advice to an investor.
Well, thank you so much, Garry, for joining us today, and appreciate all your great comments and some suggestions there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
名家讲坛，真知灼见。希望我们今天的这期节目能给大家一些启迪、一些思考。我们下期再见。
专业名家汇集，市场大势解析，投资痛点事宜，时下热点直击。欢迎收看房东网名家讲坛。